welcome to the Halloween special. Got something interesting for you today. I reached out to Grandmaster Max Illingworth because I saw he's in the process of making a YouTube channel and, looking at some content, I think it's fantastic. The chess world is small and I love to collaborate with people, and we may end up having a future Chessable collaboration together. Stay tuned on that. But the man had told me that he owns my Alekhine course, and he plays the Alekhine on a regular basis. So it should be mentioned that the Halloween bash sale is going on. And, I love the spooky thumbnail on Alekhine Defense The Dark Knight Rises. It is on sale right now. And Grandmaster Illingworth does have a few different perspectives and a little bit different take on the Alekhine. So without further ado, I'm going to let him speak for himself and, maybe get interested in some e4 Knight f6. Thanks.
What's up, guys? It's Grandmaster Max Illingworth of Illingworth Chess, here doing a guest video for Palm Beach Chess, all about the e4 Knight f6 Alekhine for black, as we can see happening after moves e4 and Knight to f6. Now, I've actually played this quite a lot in online blitz games, mostly against much lower rated players. I know that most of you watching this are players rated around, let's say, 1400-ish, 1600, 1800, around this kind of rating. So you're going to see exactly how to win against these level of opponents by me showing my personal experience of how I've won against these players by punishing some of the common opening mistakes that they make against the Alekhine defense. Because you think about the Alekhine is nowhere near as common as things like the Sicilian or e4, e5, for example. So in most cases, your opponents are not going to be prepared for this opening at all. And also, I do give the Grandmaster seal of approval to Palm Beach Chess. So make sure to like this video. It really helps boost the YouTube algorithm. And definitely consider subscribing, especially if you are new to the channel. Now, with that being said, let's get into some of my experiences with the Alekhine. Now, first thing with the Alekhine is that, of course, the move that most courses rightly focus on is the move e5. And it's the move that I face the most often. But it's worth knowing that if you take all of my games combined, then with the Alekhine, then I actually face moves other than e5 as often as e5. For example, the move knight c3 is a move I get quite a lot in my blitz games because A, it's a move that people often pre-move in blitz and bullet, just anticipating d5 or knight to f6. So we're not just going to take the pawn for free. You'd be surprised how many times in bullet games someone's played a move like knight f3 and just let me take the pawn. But of course, you guys know how to win with an extra pawn. So let's focus on knight c3 for the moment. Because here you have two different choices, or at least two main choices here. And I've actually played both of them quite a lot. Now let's say, for example, you have some experience with e4, e5. But you want to avoid some things like the Spanish, maybe avoid things like the Italian game, for example. Then you can play e5, and this is a move or a trick that I've caught out a lot of players with, because most of these guys play like knight f3 and some main line against e4, e5. And here we managed to move order them a little bit with this move order, knight f3 and knight to c6. So that's definitely one option that it requires a little bit more work, but I think it can have a high return, especially since at lower levels you're going to see a lot of bishop to c4. And I think you guys know what move to play here as black if they go bishop c4, right? Yeah, well done if you remembered the fork trick, knight takes e4. Knight takes e4, pawn d5, and you just get this dominant position in the center. Most of my opponents have played bishop d5 against me, but then it's very easy to go like bishop g4, long castles, and just play very aggressively in the center. And if knight c3, I've normally played the move queen d7 and gone for this setup of bishop d6 castles, b6, bishop f7, f5, which is just very harmonious and gives you a very strong attack with the space advantage and the bishop pair to boot. So of course there are other lines, but this video is more to show kind of the main ideas and the main mistakes that my opponents typically play, and then to show how to basically punish them. Of course you do need to be ready for other moves, for example bishop b5. The Spanish Royal Knights is a line that also deserves to be studied, though it's probably a better topic for another video. I will mention one tip though, that knight d4 is the move that's sort of the main reason I don't normally play Spanish 4 knights as white, with the idea that if they take the pawn, you go queen e7, and you end up basically getting the pawn back on e4. So on that basis, it turns out you're not just blundering a pawn, but there is an actual idea behind this Rubinstein variation. And maybe the main practical disadvantage of playing 2e5 is that they do have the very solid 4-knight Sicilian. If they play some other move, usually just hitting in the center and just playing it like a Scotch 4 knights with colors reversed tends to work pretty well for black. But if they play d4, then after takes and takes, I've normally played a move bishop to b4, just putting pressure on this pawn. This is the main line, and I will share one little shortcut that can work quite well as a way to get some winning chances, because if you play the normal lines like ed5 and like cd5 castles and just play it solidly, it's safe for black, but it can sometimes be hard to play for a win against a lower rate player if they just try to trade off a bunch of pieces. Whereas by playing castles, you kind of keep more tension in the position. If they take on c6, you end up getting a pretty nice lead in development, so normally my opponent's castle. And then bishop g4 is a little finesse I've done quite well with the idea that after a3 and bishop h5, either you get back the pawn and you've stopped their usual queen f3, bishop g5 kind of plans, or they take, you go queen d4, which I've had in a bunch of games with both colors, but especially with the black pieces. But actually, when I play this position as white, I actually have got outplayed quite a few times where I've tried to make something the bishop pair and suddenly found that I was just worse. So here you do get the pawn back, queen takes c6, and you'll play bishop to g6, trade off the bishop, rook's in the middle, and I mean the bishop versus knight imbalance does give you something to play for, and f3 does slightly open the king, so I think in a blitz game it is a little bit easier to play black in this position. But if this is too symmetrical for your liking and you want to unbalance the position a bit more, then the move that maybe fits more in the spirit of the Alekhine is the move pawn to d5. And as out d5 is that normally my opponents play e takes d5. I think that e5 is actually the better move, but nearly all of my opponents do take here. And the nice thing is now you're just transposed to a very good version of a Scandinavian, because normally if we take the normal Scandinavian move order, which I've also reached this position via with d5, ed5, knight f6. I mean, here as well, I've most often faced knight c3 and we transpose back to this. But there are also better moves like d4 and knight f3 that are quite good for white. And even moves like c4 and bishop e5 also have to be prepared for. Whereas with the Alekhine move order, we're able to get basically the best version of the Scandinavian, where we didn't lose time moving our queen around. The knight's committed to c3 a bit early. And at this point, I want to share another very instructive mistake that a lot of players, let's say 1800 and below, often make against me, which is a move that just gives black quite a strong initiative. And that move is knight takes d5. But this is just a much improved version of a normal Scandinavian again, because unlike the normal lines where the knights are here and your knight queen gets kicked around and white gets some advantage, well, here the difference is your queen is very secure. If they play a move like c4, they're just severely weakening the d4, d3 squares, but you'd be surprised how often people do this against me. Now, if they go knight f3, this is what I usually face. There's a setup that works really well, and once you remember this setup, you'll find it very easy to outplay players like 2000 and below, because it's just a very aggressive setup. In fact, it reminds me when I was a teenager, there was this FIDE master in my local Sydney area who would play this up all the time. He normally played via an e4, 1 knight c6 move order, but it's kind of a similar idea with bishop g4 pinning the knight, bishop b2, knight c6. So the easy way to remember is we're just focusing everything down on that d4 square. And after castles and long castles, we see that white is not really in time to get in d4 anymore. And if he plays h3, then actually in this position in blitz, I've normally played the move h5 and gone for this piece sack and gone for the h-file attack. Though I will admit it's probably not completely sound. I haven't really checked it with the engine, but if you don't really trust this sort of position and think, okay, I'm not willing to just give up a piece for an attack that's not completely sound, then you can just play a move like bishop h5 and put the pawn in the center. And in that case, this will still provide a useful hook for g5 and g4 to open up the king. By the way, it's probably a good moment to say as well, if you are enjoying my videos, you can also subscribe to my channel Illingworth Chess as well for more videos like this one. The link is in the description of for the subscribe link and with more of my videos and so forth. But anyway, let's continue on, because there is also a move that white can play that actually used to give me a few headaches in the past. And that's the move of knight to f3. I'm not really afraid of bishop c4 for the most part, because after knight b6 and bishop b3, I've played both the knight c6, bishop f5, this very solid setup. And the reason I've also started playing the move c5 a bit, going for c4 to trap the bishop, and because I played the Sicilian as my main defense to 1e4, at least historically, I'm generally quite comfortable in sort of positions just playing like this kind of setup. Definitely very solid and very hard for white, I think, to get a real advantage in this case. So there are a lot of ways you can play it, but knight f3 is the move that used to give me some headaches, because normally I would play knight c6, and then bishop c4 would sometimes be a little bit annoying for me at certain points. There were certain games I played against much lower players where I just lost like a beginner, but it all changed for me when I started playing this move, knight takes c3. And I do knight c3 is basically that I'm just going to switch to a Grunfeld approach. This is the way that I kind of like to play it now, because normally they go d4, and you just have this very easy plan of castle c5, knight c6, and queen a5. And it's just a much improved version of a Grunfeld, because I have these doubled pawns on c2 and c3, instead of that c2 pawn being on e4 like usual. And for example, I had a game with bishop e3, c5, he played bishop d3, I went knight c6. So here I actually played this a little bit earlier, in order to pressure this pawn a bit more quickly, and he should just castle and accept that black's just got a very comfortable position by just piling the pressure on d4. But this game my opponent blundered with d5, and okay, you guys know how to take free pieces, so I don't need to go deeper into this, I think. But that's a nice setup that's worked really well for me. Now, I will add I haven't been using the engine in this video. Normally in my videos I do use the engine, but this one because Bryan has already done this great course on the Alekhine defense for Chessable that does go into theory, and I have actually bought that course and studied it. When I studied this course, actually my results did improve in the Alekhine, because I kind of had a better understanding of the different types of positions and a better feel for what was going on. So definitely it's a course I can very highly recommend to you guys. Maybe I should have said at the very start of the video, but well, I remembered it now. So let's go back to the Alekhine. We've looked at knight c3. I've even given you 2 answers to deal with it, and moves like d3, you can just play d5 and just get kind of a good French defense in the absolute worst case, because white's best bet is probably to play d4 and just, well, play it as a French, but where, you manage to, well, you didn't even play the move e6 yet, as it were, but I also spent 2 moves playing d4, so that's a pretty decent answer. Of course, you can also play e5, and then they commit to a passive d3 setup if you like to play e4, e5, or have done so in the past. Now, I guess the one other point I will add is if they do play the move e5, that if you have experience in the French defense, which I do, that's the reason why my most common move has been knight fd7 and meeting d4 with e6 and just transposing into a standard French defense. Because sort of again, the logic is that your opponent may not have this Steinitz version in their repertoire, so if you have experience with the French, this could really throw them off. However, if you don't have experience in the French defense, the good news is you can also play the move pawn to d4 here. And the idea of pawn d4 is basically just to trade the pieces, like takes, and I will admit I do think these structures after fg7, just based on my own experience, I do find that after they play bishop d2 and something like queen h5 long castles, the positions are a little bit easier for white to play, because your king is a little bit exposed. So it's not a perfect system in blitz, but it's still reasonable if you know what you're doing, like something like maybe queen e6, queen g6. Can be one way to try to get the queens off. But normally my opponents play queen e2, and I mean the ending is just very comfortable for black, where you can just put a pawn in the center. I've had some games where after long castles, I've just played castles, gone like knight c6, e5, push the pawns forward, and in general that's given me pretty good play. I mean, the imbalance in the structure does give you chances to play for a win against a lower-rated player. In fact, there's still a lot of pieces on board, so I'd say there's pretty good chances in this case, compared at least to most sort of these equal-issue endgames. So anyhow, that's sort of how to deal with knight c3, and now we can get into the good meat and potatoes of how to deal with the critical e5. But the fact that you're only going to get this in maybe 50% of your games if you're playing like players 1400, 2000, well, that's definitely a good sign. So we played a move knight to d5, of course, and after d4, whoops, I made a mouse slip. We're not playing chess in the 16th century or 15th century where the pawns only move 1 square forward. Now, I've actually played both d6 and Bryan's suggestion of knight to b6 as well. I've played in some games, but d6 is the main move I go for, because it is the main line after all. And of course, c4 and knight f3 are the 2 main lines, and while white can try to play other moves, they tend to just give you better versions of the ideas we're going to see here. Now, one thing with the Alekhine is that even though the Alekhine is a sideline, it's actually a very flexible opening. There are a lot of different ways in which you can play it. To give you an example, if we take the move c4, which is what I face most often in my games, especially if we count in transitions with white playing c4 and then pawn at d4, well, my opponents usually play e takes d6, and Admittedly, in this case, I almost always take back with the c-pawn, just because I really like this very easy dragon setup. But it's worth pointing out that there is also a more solid ed6, which, personally, I'm not a big fan of this setup, just because I find it to be a little bit passive. You end up with this knight stuck on b6, not doing a great deal. But it is an alternative that if you think your opponent is not going to be happy in asymmetrical structures, then it's definitely an alternative. But since I'm focusing more on the way in which I've played these positions in the past, I am going to focus on cd6, and yeah, one thing a lot of my opponents do is play to move knight f3 quite early, either immediately or after knight g6, then they play knight f3. This, I think, is what you're probably going to face most often at below a 2000-ish level. Of course, if you guys are checking on something like the Lichess Opening Explorer, then you can, check it for yourself and see how the most common moves are and what the percentage scores are, at your level, whether that's 1600, 1800, or 2000 or so forth. So you can always check that for yourself, but this is just based on my personal experience of playing the Alekhine in nearly 300 games at the time of this video, at least 300 blitz games on chess.com. If we count like games I played on Lichess and Chess24 and like over a decade ago on ICC, then the number's probably more like 400-ish. But anyway, bishop g7, so they normally go bishop e3, and this is a setup where you might know of this general plan that you just go like bishop g4, knight c6, e5, and you're just basically going for a very dark squared strategy, going after this pawn in general. At least that's the way in which I've normally played it, going for bishop g4 first. And my opponents have normally castled. I've gone knight c6, and well, the idea is if they play d5, which actually one opponent did do against me, the idea is that now we have a very nice trick that basically comes very close to winning material. So what would be your move here if you were black in this case? So the idea of playing bishop to g4 is to recycle the bishop, so take, and if they play bishop f3, which my opponent didn't do in the game, you can just play like knight e5 or knight a5. And white just doesn't have a good way to defend this pawn, because if they play b3, this knight will be on. I mean, probably to have to play something like bishop takes, but you just have a much better bishop. You're still attacking b2 and c4. If queen e2, you can at the worst case do something like take and just give white this absolutely horrible structure with the doubled pawns, and I mean your piece is just perfectly placed to pile on this, so it's pretty clear that white is in a very bad way here. Of course, that explains why a move like b3 is a lot more sensible, but here there are a few different ways that we can play it. I've played moves like e5 and bishop f3 in the past, but now that I think about it, I'm kind of surprised I haven't played a move like d5 in my games. The idea of d5 is that if you get this structure with c5 and knight c8, you have this very clear plan to go e6, trade off the bishop and bring your knight to f5 and just pile the pressure on d4, using the fact that I'm going to play a3 just for argument's sake. It's not necessarily the best move, but I mean the knight can come around like this, and we see that we have one more minor piece that can attack the d4 pawn than they have that can defend it. But actually, I prepared this strategic idea in a key game that I played in the 2020 Asian Nations Online Cup, which Australia won in a massive upset. There were some really strong teams like from Indonesia, from India, and we actually ended up playing India in the finals, also Kazakhstan and some other countries in Asia that I'm forgetting. But I remember in this game I played against another GM, Navendra Priasmoro. That game went bishop e3, bishop g7. This time I played rook c1, which is known as the Voronezh variation. And after b3, there are different ways in which you can play this, where I've played moves like e5, which is the typical main line. Now, if I remember correctly, and I admit it's a long time since I studied this course, but I believe that Bryan recommends bishop f5, and that's actually the move that I played in this game. Now, I have to admit that the move bishop e2 is one I have lost twice against, and it is a move that probably is the most unpleasant to deal with. White does get an advantage. That being said, at the same time, you don't exactly play the Alekhine for equality. We play it to surprise the opponent, get an unbalanced position where we can sort of outplay the opponent with some interesting strategic ideas, trying to argue that their space could be a bit of a weakness in the long term. So after knight to f3, the whole point of this is that, well, the one mistake I often see at lower levels is they play to move knight c6 too early, and then after d5, white just gets this really beautiful structure. And if you get e5 and you can put an knight on e7, that structure is kind of okay for black, but here it's not as effective. So the idea is I played d5. This is something I actually prepared. And the thing to consider is not just the moves that were played, but also I was able to play these moves very quickly, where I played bishop g4 against him, putting the bishop here to go for the familiar plan. And compared to the other lines, white's got these extra moves in, but they don't overly affect the nature of the position. He played b4. I had looked at my opponent's chess.com blitz games a lot beforehand, so I kind of sensed he would go for this. At the same time, he spent a lot of time on these moves. He pressures my pawn. I played e6. He went rook fd1. Now, really, I did kind of misplay this position later, where I think we'll end up playing knight f5, and it was around here that my preparation finished. Unfortunately, I did misplay the position from here, where I went like queen e7, which is a very, I think, wasteful move. Probably instead, I should maybe go something like h5 and sort of keep my knight on this square, because later on I ended up playing g4, and it just ended up being very annoying. He got this strong attack on my king later. But I did go on to win the game, where he ended up in a situation where he was much better, but he had no time on the clock. It was a rapid game, and he made some mistakes in time trouble, and I was able to exploit that in order to get the win. So that's basically my general suggested system against the exchange, and it is the line I do face the most often. Now, actually, in one of my subscription services, I actually have recommended the 4 pawns attack with f4 for white, and it's something I've played a lot of different lines against, and the reason is I haven't really found something I'm completely happy with against the 4 pawns. But I've tried different things. You know, I've played d takes e5 in some games. I've gone g6. I've also experimented with move orders like starting with knight c6 on bishop f5, trying to keep my opponents guessing. I think that's probably the best approach against the 4 pawns, just to try to sense what your opponent might be most uncomfortable against. So if we take d takes e5, I've done this in some games with knight c6. And yeah, I mean, if they play bishop e3, this line is meant to be quite good for white, but I haven't really faced it, at least not via that move order. But after knight f3, they do give you the option of bishop g4, and that kind of gives you an improved version of these 4 pawns attack lines. So if you're playing this line at like an A&hard level or below, your opponents are quite likely to mess up the move order, and, well, you just get a very nice position where you can go. Actually, here I played a game where I went bishop takes f3, and just end up just winning a pawn like this. So it shows how quickly the position can fall apart for white if they're not careful. Granted, I can play g takes f3, but then you can go like queen h4, queen f4, and you're a very valuable tempo ahead of a known theoretical line, where you can get this position with the knight on c3 and white to move, because normally black plays bishop f5 and then bishop g4 on that line, but here you manage to get a whole extra tempo by comparison. Now, it is true there are other approaches. There is also g6 I've played in a few games, but I have to admit my results with g6 haven't been all that good. After knight c3, I played a move bishop e6 against Peter Michalek, but I did lose that game. So later on I ended up playing castles, and after knight f3 I usually went for it in this version, and the idea is that you're trying to provoke these pawns forward, where if c5 you get knight d5 in, you get that nice square for the knight. If d5 you get bishop g4, and you get a lot of pressure on this pawn. Now, I do think that objectively speaking, this line is very good for white if you turn on the engine, where I think you can end up like sacking the pawn and getting a really strong initiative. But in blitz games, my results have been pretty good, because you sort of have the extra pawn, and if they don't fold up quite correctly, then you can sort of consolidate and kind of be okay. So those are sort of the two main options I would probably choose between. I think the experimentation like g5 are probably a bit too overzealous, and maybe only good for hyperbullet, where they might pre-move, I don't know, fe5 or knight f3 or something. But anyway, going back to the position here, the other big question is, of course, what to do against knight f3. And I think that knight f3, along with the 4 pawns, is probably the strongest line. If pressed, actually, the f4 pawns might be even stronger, but knight f3, of course, we should do something about it. Now, the nice point is that actually, if you like to play the move order with knight to b6, and then meet the move knight f3 with d6, which I've done in quite a few games, well, it turns out this is how I usually get to the variation with d6 and knight b6. Remember, this knight b6 is a move that's not the most common. I learned of it in the New in Chess Yearbook survey many years ago. It must have been a decade ago by now. And I kind of was drawn to the fact that in a sense you're playing a Grunfeld of sorts against 1e4, because your plan is to go g6, bishop, g7, castles, and just put the pressure on the center of your pieces. So that's it's a system you can play with virtually no theoretical knowledge needed. Actually, I don't really know any theory, but I just know the general setup, and I looked at some model games many years ago in these positions. But of course, I mean, if you turn on the computer, it will say, play a4, knight c3, and white is just clearly better. But in my games, I tend to have pretty decent results with this. And really, the one line I probably have some problems with is the move bishop to e2. And I've normally played g6, but yeah, this is a line where I've had a few headaches where normally they go e takes, and it's kind of weird actually, because after e takes, they're basically, if they play c4, they transpose into the exchange variation of that we just saw beforehand. So that's kind of a nice way to sort of move order as such into some familiar territory we saw beforehand. I will admit that if they play moves like h3 and just put the pawn on c3... Well, actually, there was a game where actually an IM played c4 against me. But I played knight c6 at this point, and I went for e5, and I ended up losing this game, but I don't think it was because of the opening. I think that this is the right way to play it. Actually, I had another game against a high-rate player where he went bishop g5, but he did go on to lose, where I just play like f6, kick the bishop back, and I played king h8, which feels a little bit wasteful, but sometimes a useful move to get out of the way. So c5, queen b3, and this kind of thing. Well, I did go on to win the game, but probably not because of the opening, because I think that the ending I got is probably somewhat better for white. But, I mean, it's not sort of that terrible either, I think. I mean, definitely I can improve my play. Like, f5 is definitely a move that you want to play in these sort of positions at the very least. But at times you have to be careful of the timing because of different tactical tricks. But I don't think it's that effective here necessarily. Anyway, going back though, it is true that, well, I guess there's actually not that big of a problem that my losses weren't really because of the opening in this case. So anyway, you can play knight b6 as sort of the lazy approach, but there are other ones I've also played quite a bit with decent results. The move I actually played the most often is the move bishop g4, which it's one of these lines that basically, if you're trying to computer, it just says complete rubbish, but against the point that your opponents have probably not really studied it at all, and you can just kind of play, again, very systematic castles, knight c6, meets c4 with knight b6, and, you know, it's just very easy to play, but of course if white knows what he's doing, he does get a big advantage, so even though bishop g4 is my most common move historically, most of these are pretty old games, so I don't normally play bishop g4 anymore. I do remember actually back when I was having coaching from Grandmaster Ian Rogers, who was, you know, Australia's top player for I think 25 years or something. Well, actually I remember at that time he showed me this interesting idea of playing c6. And the idea is after castles you could just play knight d7, and, you know, if they let you, you kind of take, and you take on e5. In fact, you could even do it in this sort of way, like bishop takes, and play it in this sort of position. It's obviously where it is a merely line that the engine just says is complete rubbish and white is much better, but it is a line that, you know, can be considered if you want some one-game surprise weapon that forces a more strategic type of position that maybe your opponent's not so familiar with. But okay, now we're going to get to a line that I think is probably objectively the best way for black to play. I still remember actually many years ago, Vladislav Artemiev played bishop f5 against me in a bullet game and completely destroyed me. But again, probably not because of the move itself. But I think the most reliable move is probably to play d takes e5, knight takes e5, and then play pawn to g6, or to move pawn to c6. But I played to move g6 a little bit more often, and actually had 2 wins against played with a somewhat decent rating where after bishop c4, I think the normal move is just to play c6 and kind of move order him into a 5c6 line where the bishop is not so ideally placed. But I played some other moves in my games. I had a game where I went bishop g7, and I also had a game at a high level where I went bishop e6, which, if I remember correctly, I think is also a way that Magnus Carlsen has played these positions, just kind of keeping the tension between the bishops and so forth. So after bishop e4, I played c6, and had this game against a 2800 raid player in Blitz, where even though I think white is probably somewhat better if he plays correctly, like rook e1, knight e7, he should just go knight f3, which is what he did. But I was sort of able to make this work where I've read it, so whilst I played a game, I kind of forgot what happened, but ended up going like a5, sort of grabbing some space on the queen side, and somehow, like, because I was able to play very systematically, and eventually getting a c5 push, I was able to outplay my opponent and win the game. Though it is true from the opening perspective, he was a bit better. But you can also play c6, and, you know, in this case, white should probably just play bishop e2 or h3, and as long as he, like, knows these ideas of meeting knight d7, knight f3, then he does get a bit of a small advantage. You know, just keeping the pieces on the board. Like, you want to keep the minor piece on the board when you have a space advantage. Now, you can certainly check Alexander Bortnik's games. He plays the Alekhine quite a lot on chess.com, I think, as one of his main defenses. So, he's an expert to check out if you want to play it this way, as in the main line. But I've sort of shown my interpretation. I normally haven't played this c6 line, but maybe I will play it in the future, because one thing I've been doing on chess.com is I've been trying to play as many different variations as possible. So maybe this is one I can add to the list as one to play a bit more often. And yeah, finally, the one other system I do play sometimes is to meet knight f3 with d5, which I know that Bryan gives an alternative in his Alekhine course. It's a sort of line where, yeah, admittedly, objectively, it's just much better for white if he plays correctly, but it's also something your opponents are very unlikely to know. And also in a blitz game, it's just so easy to play bishop g4, e6, c5, knight c6, and play it almost kind of like a Caro-Kann. It's an uneasy system, again, I'm probably going to play a little bit more often in some games, but it definitely makes more sense probably as a surprise weapon or a backup line than as your exclusive system. Because Because if you play it every game, someone will just flick on the engine and say, oh, I get +1 if I just play this plan. But if the opponent doesn't know what they're doing, I think this is a pretty nice way to get a more strategic position where you can try to outplay them. In that sense, it kind of reminds me a lot of some lines like Caracan's, or also the rat with e4, d6, and some of those check systems with pawn c6 and so forth. At least structurally, it's kind of similar. Anyway, I think that's about all I want to share in terms of the Alekhine. Of course, one can always go deeper, but this is a pretty good summary of my personal experiences playing this opening with black. So yeah, glad you guys enjoyed the video. Comment below what was the main thing that you learned from this video. With that being said, do make sure to check out my channel. I put the link in the description so that you can subscribe to my channel very easily. I'm actually very close to 1,000 subscribers at the time of this video, so really appreciate your support. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next chess video. Get out of here.